There's a question which was asked yesterday, which I didn't address, but it was asked. The previous parsha, we speak about the Seres Hadibros, 10 Commandments. The parsha ends with the building of the Mizbeach and how it should be built. You're not permitted to cut the stone with a metal implement because iron is made for shortening life, and the Mizbeach is to extend life. One is war, one is peace. Therefore, it's inappropriate. And then we begin the laws, and they're all Sinai laws. That's the Vav connecting, just as the previous ones laws stated were from Hashem. These are also the Sinai laws. But the first law, which we discuss, are the laws which pertain to a person who steals Eved Ivri, and he sold into slavery to a Jewish master because he doesn't have the means to compensate the person who he victimized. I mean, is that the first thing we speak about? Right after Sinai, coming off Sinai, we speak about stealing. Seemingly, there are other laws which we could discuss, which are discussed later, honoring a parent. If one hits a parent, one, God forbid, curses a parent, what the level of liability is. Or a person who sells his daughter as a maidservant due to his impoverished state, and then the master marries her, and the marriage is an adult would marry a woman, the woman would consent. I mean, that could have been discussed. But the first thing we discuss is a person who is sold into slavery because he steals. Why? The Chofetz Chaim writes in one location that in the second portion of Krishma, we speak about if you observe the mitzvos, which I command you, the rains will come at that time, you'll have the bounty, you'll reap your own harvest, so on and so forth. Then we say, but you have to be very careful that you should not be seduced by your hearts. And what do we say? And because if you're seduced by your hearts, you'll end up serving Elohim Acherim, false gods. You'll end up with be involved in idolatry. I mean, if you allow yourself to be seduced, you'd say you won't observe Shabbos properly, you won't observe Kashrus properly. We go from you're observing the mitzvos and you're worthy of the ultimate, and then, but you have to be careful, you should not be seduced by your heart, because you can end up serving false gods, idolatry. I mean, does it happen that quickly? Most people, it doesn't happen to. So but you have to be careful, because if you allow your heart to seduce you, you're gonna end up there. So what is the Torah telling us? This is Chofetz Chaim, that the moment you allow yourself to be seduced by your heart, you never know where you end up. As they say, it's a slippery slope. You say, I'll compromise this, I'll rationalize this, but you don't realize where you're going. The moment you allow yourself that so-called that leeway to allow yourself to compromise anything, once you're compromised, you never know where that ends up. I'll give you an example. Person buys a house, and the foundation, and he gets an engineer, he does a check, they find out the foundation is cracked. And they say, you realize the foundation is cracked, in about 6 years, the house is going to shift, and ultimately you can have major problems. And eventually, you're going to have to rebuild the house. But you got 6 years. 6 years. But, if I'm investing this kind of money in buying a house, and the foundation is cracked, it's not worthwhile to buy the house, because ultimately the house is going to actually shift, and it's going to collapse. The moment you allow that breach, and what's the breach? It's called seduction of the heart. That breach is a direct beeline to idolatry. But maybe I won't arrive there. The Torah is telling us, you have to be careful. It's a negative commandment. If you allow yourself to be seduced, Ultimately, it's connected to that. Therefore, you're not permitted to allow yourself to have that leeway to justify anything if it's a compromise. We have this in Parshas in Yisro, very famous Chazal, Kol hamerachim ala azorim, a person who has mercy for those who are cruel, ultimately, ya'achzir ala rachmanim. Hear this? A person who's cruel, who's merciful to those who are cruel, which it should not be merciful to those who are cruel, ultimately will be cruel to those who are merciful. Who's this referring to? So the Medrash tells us, Shaul HaMelech, he was told by Hashem to go to war and destroy Amalek. And what happened? He spared the king, Agag. Agag, as we mentioned yesterday, was personified Amalek, a level of evil, cruelty, which is not to be fathomed, what level of cruelty there was. And Agag and Shaul had some degree of mercy. How do I wipe out a people not to leave you the king? So he left the king, he spared the king. So he was Rachmonim al Arzorim. He utilized that characteristic of Rachmonis on a person who's the Arzor. The question, how do you do it? He's an Arzor. The answer is, you allow, Hashem says, wipe them out. Yimocher, they should be obliterated. They should be eradicated. How did you leave him? The answer is, I felt this time we could have a moment of compassion for this kind of man. That means you're allowing your emotion to actually to evaluate the situation and to spare the Arzori. But how do you do such a thing? Your feelings have no relevance. Hashem dictates, and this is the dictate. You have no right to compromise. The moment you feel you have a right to compromise, and you can be a Rachman on the Arzor, what happened by Novir Kohanim? When they harbored David HaMelech, he gave the order to wipe them out. They wiped out Novir Kohanim because they harbored David. So the person who allowed himself to allow his emotion to dictate, to have influence and compromise what he should have done, once you allow yourself, you give yourself that opening and you have that level of vulnerability, you'll even be A'achzor and Rachmanim. That's why ultimately he wiped out the Ir Nov Kohanim. And ultimately Shaul and his children were killed in battle with the Pelishtim because of that. This is the concept. You should not allow your hearts to be seduced. But this one time, but you realize the moment you give leeway to that, and you let the entry of the Yetzer Hara to be able to justify anything, well, it's just this one time, it's not as important. The moment you allowed yourself to be hoodwinked, and you don't see it as Hashem communicated to dictate, ultimately you could end up there. That's the concept. We find, I asked the question, there's a phenomenal word from, I mentioned him, his name was Motul Pagramansky. He was one of the pre-World War II Gedolim Torah sages. And after he survived the war in France, he passed away in his 50s. And he dealt with all the survivors, thousands and thousands of Jews, and he was their Torah leader. He pointed out something beautiful. We find that after Avram Avinu sent off Hagar and Yishmael, because Sari Menu had shared with Avram Avinu that Yishmael's mitzachik, his behavior is not appropriate, and it could influence Yitzchak, who's the future patriarch. Avram was a little upset, and Hashem says, whatever Sarah tells you, you should heed her voice because it's prophetic. And from there we learn that Sarah Menu was a greater prophetess than Avram Avinu. So it says she left and she was toa baderech. She was lost on the way. So Rashi says, what is the meaning? She was lost on the way. And that's when the Malach came to her, and when Yishmael was dying of thirst, so on and so forth. So Rashi says, what's toa baderech? She returned to her idolatry. So he says, how does Rashi know, or Chazal know, the word toeh, you're lost on the way, it means she returned to her idolatrous ways. So he explains, he says, because of a person who's intimately connected to Hashem, you're never lost. Even if you don't know your way, you're not lost, because you have that faith and that belief, and therefore you're always secure. The only reason why she felt she was lost, she was going astray, was because she returned to the idolatry of a family. That's Ramotel Pagramonski. So I asked the question. We find afterwards, Malach speaks to her. After she finds water, gives water to her son, and her son survives, a Malach calls from Shamayim and speaks to her. I mean, if a woman returns to idolatry, how does she have a relevance to a Malach speaking to her? We find Rashi regarding Hagar earlier, that why wasn't Hagar intimidated when the Malach went originally, when she fled from Sarimenu into the desert? Why wasn't she overwhelmed and literally paralyzed by this communication with a Malach? We find that by the father of Shimshon and the mother, when the Malach came, they thought they were going to die. So Rashi says, because she was familiar with Malachim in the home of Avram Avinu. So it wasn't something out of the ordinary. Okay? Here, she was Chazal Gilu Aviyah. She returned to the idolatry of a family. And that's why we say she's went astray. She lost her way. So I mean, how does a Malach speak to her? How does she, and she has a communication with a Malach. She went back to idolatry. How do we understand it? So what I said was exactly this. When it says she left Avram Avinu, she didn't go back to the idolatry immediately. But once she detached from Avram Avinu, that means the level of clarity that she had when she was with Avram Avinu, once that relationship, she believed, was severed, there were many things which she would consider not idolatry, chas v'shalom, not that. But the moment you consider things and to make compromises, that's going back to idolatry of a father. Since that was a background originally, the moment you give that opening, it's a slippery slope. She could even go back there. Therefore, you're Torah. The moment there's any level of breach in that relationship, it's not totally Hashem, then we talk about going astray. Doesn't mean she went to idolatry immediately. If that's the case, how does the Malach communicate with her? She's an idolater. She's become a pagan. She's not a pagan. But it's the same idea. What the Torah is telling us, you're at Sinai, you're coming off the mountain. Hashem prophesied openly in the wake state. The first thing we speak about. Person steals, he doesn't have the means to repay. First he victimizes, he's sold as a slave, a Jewish slave. He's given a Canaanite woman who normally he's not permitted to, and he bears children from her, and the children not even considered his kids. They're not his children. His wife's not his wife, because she's a Canaanite woman. The children become the chattels of the master. Look where the man's ended up. What the Torah is telling us, it's a slippery slope. You could be at Sinai. You could be at the most exceptional level. The moment the person justifies anything, you're vulnerable. You go even to stealing. To that degree, you fall. And ultimately, even to marry, to be given a Canaanite woman. And Rabbeinu Bachya says, what's the slave called? He's called Eved Ivri. Why isn't he called Eved Yisraeli? Post-Sinai, we're called Yisrael. We're not called Ivri. Ivri was pre-Sinai. Post-Sinai, we're Yisrael. The answer is, so Rashi says, why, if he says, Ahavti es Adoni es ishti vesbona, I love my master, you put the hole through his ear? Because we say, Ozen zu sheshama b'Sinai, the air that heard at Sinai, you should not steal. He went and stole, and as a result of that, that's why he's in this predicament. What does that mean? So Rabbeinu Bachya says, if he would have fully internalized what he heard at Sinai, he wouldn't be here today. It's only because he did not. So his behavior is what? Is similar to the pre-Sinai Jew. Because if he'd be a post-Sinai Jew, this would have never happened. That's Israel. He's an Eved Ivri. He's still behaving as if Sinai never took place. And only because of that, therefore he's in this predicament He justified stealing. He couldn't repay the person he victimized. He's sold into slavery. He's given to Canaanite woman. He believes, and the relationship is the equivalent of a wife, and he believes, he says, I love my master, my wife, who's not your wife, your children are not your children. So what do we say? So therefore, even though previously we spoke of the Mizbeach, we spoke about Kabbalah Satorah, we spoke of everything, but you realize, the moment you allow compromises, you never know where you end up, even to steal and be an every given the Canaanite woman and bear children from her. And you become a breeder. That a person violates a negative commandment or something, violates the Torah, and then he becomes a repeated offender. He violates it a second time. It's not slok keheter. It becomes permitted. So the Gemara says, how is it permitted? The Gemara says, it's not permitted. The way he deals with it is if there's nothing wrong with it. A person in his own mind, you do something once wrong, you have a conscience, and you feel bad. And that's why the Rabbeinu Yonah cites the moment you sin at the Gemara, based on the Gemara, you should do tshuva immediately. Make the correction. Because you go back there and you become a repeated offender because you have a conscience. The first time you have guilt, how did I do such a thing? So the guilt is something very valuable because due to the guilt, you feel the remorse, and you have the remorse, you do tshuva. What about the person, he liked what he did, he enjoyed it, and he wants to go back for more? What does he do? He suppresses the guilt. Because if you don't suppress the guilt, a person can't live with guilt. So somehow he frames it, he justifies it. It's not so terrible. So what, he goes back, does it a second time. Once he does it a second time, it's not slok keheter. He sees it, it's permitted. Not that it's permitted. The way he internalizes it, relates to it, it's permitted. And the more he sees it permitted, he goes back for more. And as a result of more, eventually he conditions himself that this is something which is 100% permitted. That's what happens. The slave, he's given a slave woman to really wake him up. Years ago, to a woman, and given a woman who's not even Jewish. She's a Canaanite slave. And what do you do with her? To have relations purely for the sake to produce children, and the children are not even yours. You're like an animal, a breeder. And after being subject to this kind of abuse, degradation, after 6 years, said, this is paradise, this is great. I want to continue this. My master, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my kids. This is what it's all about. They say, are you out of your mind? Do you realize where you come from and who you are? You realize you're an Ivri. What happened at Sinai, he's called Eved Ivri, not Eved Yisraeli. This is Rabbeinu Bachi's point. That's what it's all about. Of course, if you realize, but what happened, how did this happen? People, when you're exposed to something long enough, people acclimate themselves. They get used to it, and they even like it. Answer it. Why the Torah allows this?
Right. Why does the Torah allow that a Jew can enslave another Jew, and then he has that taiva to stay with that wife and children that was given to him?
And
isn't there a better way to punish this guy for stealing?
Okay. So I mentioned there's no penal system. This is the way he went and victimized a fellow Jew by stealing. And he doesn't have the means to pay back. And he doesn't have the ability to borrow to repay the person he victimized. And evidently, if the court could raise the money, they would raise the money that he should not become a slave. But sometimes people have to be taught a lesson. They have to be taught a lesson. And maybe through this experience of being humiliated to this degree, you wake up. Some people don't wake up. How many people, they go to prison, and when they come out, they're out a short while, they commit the crime again, and they're back in the prison. And all their lives, it's like a revolving door, out, in, back. But if you were in such an appalling setting, how did you cross that line again? Going back there. But that's the way it is. Some people don't learn. But hopefully, the concept of prison is, from that negative experience, being denied freedom, maybe you wake up. But the Torah there's a certain clause within being sold as a slave that the master who has a Jewish slave, if he has one quality piece of bread, the slave takes priority over the master. If you have one comfortable bed, the slave gets the bed over the master. A quality garment, the slave has priority. So the Gemara says in Kedushin, Hakona Evid Latzmo, Kona Odin Latzmo. The person who purchases a Jewish slave, you're buying a master. You have to treat the slave as if he's your master. So this is one of the levels of discouragement that a person should not buy the slave, to prevent the person being drawn into such an environment that he's actually going to be maybe victimized. It's self-destruction over here in this environment. So not only that, when you sold as a slave for stealing, the value of the slave has to be exactly the amount of the theft. If it's more or less, the person can be sold twice to cover the same debt. Let's say the theft was $1,000 and he sold for $900. It's not sold because the sale value will not cover the theft. What about if he's worth more? He stole $1,000, he's worth $1,200. He's not sold. The number, his value has to be the exact amount that the theft was to cover that cost. So how often do you think this happened? Very rarely happened. There's another case of a slave. It's called mocharatzmo. A person sells himself because he chooses. But in terms of being sold due to stealing, it was very rare. Because I told you, as I'm telling you, the master doesn't want such a slave. And the number, his value has to be exactly the number of the theft. Same value. It doesn't jive, he's not sold. So this situation over here was really very, very rarely that it happened, where it was the exact number. The master was such a wealthy man, didn't make a difference to him, and he was sold. And hopefully we hope that he'll be discouraged during the 6-year period, given such a wife and being abused as a breeder. And now after 6 years, he says this is something out of the ordinary. Out of the ordinary. I love my master, I love my wife. You put the hole through his ear, say, you know something, you somehow, you weren't on the boat, you weren't there at Sinai in terms of the way you behave. Phenomenal question. Phenomenal question. The Yetzer Hara, who created the evil inclination? Hashem. And this gives us challenges. And due to the challenges, if we meet the challenge, our level of accomplishment has greater value. Because if you naturally do the right thing, the action is not attributed to the person. It's only due to your own initiative. That's why you did the right thing. Right? That's the whole concept of Bechira, free choice. So I think Mark asked the question. Every situation where you're confronted by Yetzer Hara, by the evil inclination, it's Lifnei V'Lo Michshol. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created life is Lifnei V'Lo Michshol. There's a stumbling block. Why can't I offer a Jew not kosher meat or a Nazir wine, which he's not permitted to drink? Because you never know. He may succumb and drink it. Even I don't know, but he may do it. That's exactly what life's all about. Continuous challenges. You're confronted with situations. Do I cross the line? Don't I cross the line? Hopefully you won't cross the line. So Hashem is creating a scenario of Michshol. And yet he poses on us, that was the question. Phenomenal question. And it's based on a Gemara. The Gemara says in Ksubis, Avram Avinu was thrown into a kiln, and he went into the kiln, miraculously came out alive. The next event similar to that, what happened to Avram Avinu, was the time of Nebuchadnezzar, when the Jews were in Bavel, after the destruction of the first base of Mikdash. And Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, made an image of himself, and he says, every person must bow. And if you don't bow, you go into the kiln. There were 3 Jews, Hanani, Mishael, Azariah. They were all from Shevet Yehuda. They would not bow. So Nebuchadnezzar gave him a choice. Either go into the kiln, or you're going to be what? Or you're going to be, if you don't bow, you're going to the kiln, and you'll be incinerated. You'll be cremated. They said, we're going into the kiln. They went to the kiln, they came out. Miraculously, Simatav Ramavinu. So the Gemara says, the Chanam Mishol Azario, if Nebuchadnezzar would have said to them, if you don't bow, well, you're going to be beaten to death, they would have succumbed to the pain and they would have bowed. It's only because it was instantaneous death, that's why they were able to meet that challenge. But if it would have been, you'll be beaten and tortured, they would have bowed. That's the Gemara. So Tosafos asks a question. We're talking about idolatry. A Jew has an obligation to give his life. It's the Yarav al Yavar. Normally we say, live by my Torah, don't die for my Torah. If it's idolatry, to say Cham Shol Zara, they would have bowed if they would have been tortured, if they would have been beaten. That's Tosafos' question. So Tosafos gives an answer. The Chassam Sofer answers, it says, if they would have been beaten, they would have bowed. So the question is, so why weren't they beaten? That's the question. So Chassam Sofer answers, what is a test? A test is a test only if you're able to withstand the test. If I give a person 1,000 pounds to put on his back to see if he can carry it, that's a test? It's not a test. That's called you crushing the person. It's impossible for a person or 5,000 pounds. Not possible. A human being doesn't have the capacity to carry 5,000 pounds. It's not a test. You're ending his life. You're crushing him. A test is only a test because a person in reality has the ability to meet the challenge. And Hashem knows you have the ability. Now it's up to you. Are you going to meet the challenge? You're not going to meet the challenge. But there's no question. If you choose, you can meet that challenge. So what the Gemara is saying, if they would have been beaten, they would have succumbed to the pain. They couldn't tolerate the pain. And because Hashem knows that, it's not a test. Therefore, what was the test? Do you go into the kiln? Don't you go into the kiln? So therefore, Chassam Sofer says, whenever you're confronted with a test, very often say, it's just too much for me. You should know if it's presented to you, you have the ability to overcome it. And you're deluding yourself. Or you're mistaken. You have the ability. Because Hashem will never give a person a situation that he can't deal with, because if that's the case, it's not a test. So you should know in advance, if it's a test, you have the ability to deal with it. When I go, so that's the Yetzer Hara. Whenever Hashem allows the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, to present us with challenges, every one of those challenges, we have the ability to deal with it. That's what's not Lifnei Velocite Bichshol. But what about if I offer a person not kosher meat, and I create that scenario? That's my choice. Do I know whether he can overcome that test? Hashem knows, because Hashem dictates with the Yetzer Hara. Each person has a different level of challenge. But me as a mortal go and offer a nose of wine, or a Jew not kosher meat, and there's a chance he may eat it. Do I know whether he will eat it? Won't eat it. If we have no right to put that person in the position, not knowing whether they'll be able to meet that challenge and they meet the challenge. Therefore, that's the provision of the Lifnei Velocite Bichshol.